The old kingdom had fallen. Chaos had reigned. Egypt fractured into warring provinces, each ruled by petty kings. Fields lay abandoned. The Nile flowed past empty granaries and silent temples. It seemed the gods had turned their backs. But from the southern city of Thebes, a new hope emerged. Mentuhotep II, a warrior, a unifier, a visionary, marched north with an army not only of soldiers, but of ambition. After years of brutal conflict, he crushed his rivals and declared himself the sole ruler of a united Egypt. The Middle Kingdom was born. With unity restored, Thebes flourished. Grand temples rose from the dust. Statues of the victorious pharaoh stood tall beneath the desert sun. Craftsmen carved stories into stone once more. The land began to breathe again. But it was not peace alone that returned. Discipline came with it. The new Egypt was no longer reckless. It was calculated, efficient, governed by an ever-growing class of scribes and administrators. The pharaoh was no longer just a god-king. He was a shepherd, guiding a wounded people back to balance. And so Egypt was reborn not just by conquest, but by purpose. The scars of collapse remained, but the vision of the Middle Kingdom was clear. Strength, unity, order. And just beyond the riverbanks, the future waited, full of words, wonders, and war. The Middle Kingdom was not forged by the sword alone. What followed conquest was far more radical, a transformation of kingship itself. No longer distant gods upon thrones, pharaohs became shepherds, guardians of the people, caretakers of justice, and arbiters of balance. The ancient concept of Ma'at, truth, balance, harmony, was reborn. Not as a distant ideal, but as a living code. The pharaoh's role was to uphold it, to be its vessel. He walked among the farmers. He consulted his scribes. He ruled not with thunder, but with law. And in the great halls of Thebes, where incense coiled through the air, laws were inscribed, grievances heard, villages protected. The land thrived beneath the shade of justice. But the peace was delicate. The shepherd's hand could not falter. For beyond the borders, rival kings still watched. Within, famine or dissent could return at any moment. The Middle Kingdom was strong because it was organized, structured, watched. Scribes recorded every bushel of grain. Inspectors walked canals. Justice was not a statue, it was a system. And behind it all stood the pharaoh, not as tyrant, not as god, but as the one who bore the weight of order. This was New Egypt, and its ruler was not just feared, but trusted. For centuries, Egypt had spoken through stone, through monuments, temples, and tombs. But now, a quieter voice began to rise. Not the voice of kings, but of scribes, of wanderers, of fear, longing, and wisdom. This was the dawn of Egyptian literature. In classrooms beneath shaded porticos, children copied lines onto shards of limestone. They learned not only to count, but to feel, to write, to remember. Tales whispered between columns were finally written down. Parables of justice, dialogues of the soul, the tale of the shipwrecked sailor, the instruction of Amenemhat, and above all, the tale of Sinuhe, the story of a court official who flees Egypt, haunted by guilt, surviving in foreign lands before returning in remorse. It spoke of exile, of home, and of the human heart. No longer did Egypt speak only of gods. It now spoke of man. These stories weren't mere entertainment. They were tools of power, echoes of national identity. The pharaohs ensured their scribes preserved these voices, not just for pleasure, but for control. To write was to rule, and those who wrote became gatekeepers of history, of law, and of memory. The pen in Egypt had become as mighty as the crown. Beneath the might of the pharaoh and the reach of the army stood the pen. The scribe, unseen, uncelebrated, held Egypt together, not with spears, but with ink. From grain counts to border treaties, temple records to royal decrees, nothing moved in Egypt without a scribe's mark. In their hands, the empire had memory. In their words, it had continuity. To become a scribe was to rise above the fields, to step into a world of intellect, precision, and quiet power. Scribe schools were the gateways. There, discipline was law. Young boys practiced day and night, lines upon lines, characters etched into muscle and mind. And when they graduated, they became the nerves of Egypt, spread across every province from Nile Delta to Nubia, keeping the machine alive. These were no mere clerks. They were diplomats, tax assessors, court recorders, historians. They advised generals, recorded plagues, preserved dreams. One ink stroke could change a life. One scroll could shift the fate of a village or a kingdom. And though the pharaohs built monuments, it was the scribes who made sure they were remembered. South of the first cataract, where the Nile roared through granite cliffs, lay a land rich in gold, ivory, and danger. Nubia, gateway to Africa, land of warriors, trade, and mystery. Egypt could not thrive without it, and so it marched. In the Middle Kingdom, the pharaohs launched bold campaigns into Nubia, not just to conquer, but to control. They didn't build only temples, they built fortresses, massive stone bastions, Semna, Buhan, Uranarti, planted like teeth along the river. These were not mere outposts, they were cities of command, garrisoned, fortified, and alive with scribes, soldiers, traders. The Nile became a border, and beyond it, Egypt watched, vigilant, calculating. But conquest was not cruelty, it was strategy. Egyptians brought order, trade, governance, and in return, Nubia gave gold. And what gold it was! From its mines came the wealth that gilded temples, crowned kings, and fed the ambitions of empire. But Egypt knew, wealth breeds envy. And so the southern gates stood strong, immovable, silent, and always watching. The heart of empire now beat in two lands, and the pulse of power flowed through Nubia's golden veins. Egypt had long ruled its own land, but beyond the desert, across seas of myth and mist, lay a realm that stirred the imagination. Punt, the god's land, a place of incense trees, shimmering gold, towering myrrh groves, and baboons that spoke to the heavens. Pharaohs did not dream of conquest here, they dreamed of connection. And so the ships were built, long, sleek vessels of cedar and rope, packed with soldiers, scribes, interpreters, and wonder. From ports on the Red Sea, they vanished into the unknown. Weeks passed, then months. The court waited, breathless, until at last they returned, laden with riches, with exotic animals, rare spices, and resin so sacred it was burned in every temple from Thebes to Memphis. What was Punt? A land of trade, of gods, of lost ancestry. No map could hold it, no conqueror could claim it. But to Egypt, it was proof of divine favor, a mirror of paradise on earth. The journey to Punt was not about possession, it was about belonging to a cosmos, to the divine, to a story far larger than any one pharaoh. And still, in the silence between waves, the name of Punt is whispered across time, across oceans, across dreams. Egypt's might did not flow from conquest alone. It flowed with the goods of the world. From the mountains of Lebanon came cedar. From the shores of Crete, fine pottery. From Nubia, gold and cattle. From Punt, incense and exotic beasts. Every port, every fortress, every border station pulsed like a heart chamber, keeping the empire alive. At the center, the Nile. The river was no mere waterway. It was an artery. It carried ships and scrolls, priests and wheat, tribute and tales. Trade was sacred, taxed, watched, celebrated. In markets from Memphis to Elephantine, voices clashed in a dozen tongues. Bronze tools, obsidian blades, oils, perfumes, everything had value. But trade wasn't just about objects. It was diplomacy. To trade was to recognize power. To pay tribute was to submit or to ally. Egypt grew fat on tribute, on baskets of grain, bolts of linen, and chests of gems. But tribute also fed pride, and pride fed records. Scribes wrote endlessly of what came from where, of who gave and who obeyed. Each scroll a declaration. Egypt rules not just by sword, but by scale. The empire was no island, it was a web, spun from ships, scrolls, and silver. And through this web, Egypt did not only survive, it endured. Egypt had always carved its memory in stone, but now it began to speak in story. In the courts of pharaohs and the homes of scribes, a quiet revolution was blooming. Literature, the words of the people, the doubts of the soul, the fates of kings and cowards alike, etched in ink, whispered by candlelight. The tale of Sinuhe, a runaway courtier fleeing Egypt, wrestling with identity and exile. The dialogue of a man with his soul, a voice from the dark, debating life and death, hope and despair. These were no hymns to gods or decrees of kings. They were questions, raw, personal, eternal. Scribes now carried more than orders. They carried insight. And through their reed pens, the Middle Kingdom birthed a new Egypt, one that thought deeply, doubted, and dreamed. Literature became memory. Memory became culture. And the stories of this golden age would echo across the centuries until they reached the libraries of modern men. The pen had joined the pyramid, and both would defy time. Egypt's borders were more than lines in sand. They were walls of fire and stone. To the south, Nubia lay rich and wild, a land of gold, warriors, and ancient gods. For centuries, its land beckoned with treasures and threats alike. The Middle Kingdom pharaohs answered not with reckless war, but with fortresses, monuments of power standing tall along the Nile's bend. These stone giants were both shields and statements, guarding trade routes, watching deserts. They were the empire's eyes and fists, garrisoned with soldiers sworn to hold the line. These fortresses marked the edge of civilization and the frontier of empire. But the desert whispered of danger. Raiders and rebels lurked beyond the walls. And far in the shadows, new enemies stirred. Strangers on the horizon who would one day thunder across the delta, threatening to rewrite Egypt's story. For now, the fortresses stood firm, silent sentinels in a land of gold and blood. For generations, Egypt's Nile Delta had been a cradle of life and a vulnerable doorstep. But now, dark shadows gathered beyond the marshes, strangers with unfamiliar faces and thunderous war chariots. These were not traders or envoys. They were invaders. From the north and east, mysterious peoples crossed the fertile lands, their intentions unclear, but their power undeniable. The air thrummed with tension as Pharaoh's scouts raced to the borders, warning of swift horses and iron weapons. The age of diplomacy and trade was ending. The age of war was dawning. Fortresses and scrolls, alliances and tributes, would they withstand the coming storm? Egypt held its breath. The thunder of chariots was near, and history's next chapter was about to begin.